The Dune universe is a vast cluster of worlds, initially united by the old Empire, then by the Titans, then by a sentient computer, and then once again by the Empire. But, oddly enough, in the so-called known universe, the force that held the planets together was religion. At least this is how the author of the first Dune novels, Frank Herbert, saw the situation. But there's always a black sheep in the family. And among the worlds wrapped in canonical rules, there is always a reformer, a revolutionary, a dissenter. In Dune, this dissenter is Ix, a planet where technology is valued above all faith. And of course, those who, disregarding all prohibitions, invent that technology. Frank Herbert himself did not pay much attention to Ix. The center of his narrative is always Arrakis, the sole producer of the irreplaceable spice. However, the support given by Duke Leto Atreides to the rulers of Ix sets off the chain of events in the first books. So, what is Ix? And who are the Ixians, persistently opposing the rule of the Atreides across the universe? Why didn't God Emperor Leto II Atreides destroy them, foreseeing their hostile intentions? And how did the dissenters ultimately save humanity? Let's find out. There are discrepancies in the epic regarding the early history of Ix. In the original version by Frank Herbert, Ix is the 9th planet of the Eridani system and was called Komos before the Butlerian Jihad. It was a vassal planet of Riches and was governed by an exarch appointed by the metropolis. The inhabitants of Komos worshipped the ancestral goddess Kubeb and honored the cult of family. Frank Herbert described the origin of the planet's inhabitants as conditionally Chinese. Brian Herbert and his co-author, who significantly expanded the Dune universe, gave Ix a slightly different backstory. According to their version, during the time of the Old Empire, Ix was known as Rodale Ix, and its population had fully Caucasoid roots. Essentially, the differences end there. Rodale Ix was still vassal of Riches before the Titans' uprising. The planet itself resembled Earth, but with a milder climate. The average annual temperature on Ix is 22 degrees Celsius. Winter temperatures average 2 degrees and summer 34 degrees. The equatorial diameter is 40,000 kilometers, and the land-to-water ratio is 50-50. Freshwater lakes cover 10% of the surface. In principle, it's an ideal world for farmers, and it was agrarian until the Titan Xerxes came to power. To implement the Titans' revolutionary plans for seizing the empire, Xerxes killed his entire family. This wasn't an ideological act. He simply needed to access the wealth of his house, which then ruled Komos. After taking over the empire, the Titans began actively reforming. For instance, Xerxes renamed his planet to Ix. Unfortunately, that same Xerxes became the first victim of Omnius. Ix became part of the synchronized empire. The brutal slavery that ensued affected not only ordinary people, but even the Titans themselves, largely a consequence of Xerxes' insatiable thirst for amusement. The rule of sentient machines launched new processes on Ix, thanks to the planet's rich natural resources. A powerful industrial base was established. Machines made machines. The enslaved humans attempted uprisings, but these were brutally suppressed. The Ixians were aided by the forces of the Butlerian Jihad. By that time, however, a very peculiar society had formed on the planet, inclined toward developing and producing complex technologies. This worried the League of Nobles, but the war with Omnius was more urgent than enforcing bans. Sensing the approaching defeat of the machines, Omnius struck humanity with a synthetic virus known as the Omnius Plague. Ix, once again, was among the first to suffer. The quarantine measures attempted by Abelard Harkonnen brought little help to the Ixians. Over 2/3 of the population died from the Omnius Plague, and the agrarian infrastructure was devastated by riots and fires. Many of the survivors were left disabled. Nonetheless, Ix endured and recovered. Moreover, after the defeat of Omnius and the Synchronized Empire, Ix became the only place where progressive technologies continued to be developed. The bans imposed by the Butlerians and the Church seemed not to apply to the inhabitants of Ix. To conceal their flirtation with forbidden technologies, the Ixians moved their science and manufacturing deep beneath the planet's surface. Frankly, this decision even benefited the planet's biosphere. On the surface, Ix once again looked like a peaceful agrarian world. In the final years before the Guild, the Ixians were developing and producing actual computers. These were needed by Norma Senva for her experiments with space folding. However, the Ixian scientists didn't dare to go beyond super-advanced computing machines. Alas, even such technologies were ruthlessly cleansed by the fanatics of the Butlerian Jihad. Norma Senva had to solve the problem of interstellar travel differently, with the help of spies from Arrakis. Nevertheless, neither the fledgling Space Guild, nor the Imperial House Carino, nor the Lanzarad, nor even the Bene Gesserit could do without technology. This is where Ix and Riches came into play, having avoided the purge by the radical Butlerians. After the end of the Butlerian Jihad, the primary law became the Orange Catholic Bible. At the core of both religious and secular rules lay a strict prohibition not only on artificial intelligence. Most complex technologies were also outlawed, both religiously and imperially. However, it's difficult to cross the universe in a wooden cart. That's why the science and manufacturing on Riches and Ix seemed not to exist for the ruling house in the Landsraad. In the early years of the Padishah Empire, the Carinos favored Ix for purely human reasons. The daughter of the ruler of Ix was close to the Empress. For many millennia, House Vernia successfully ruled Ix from its underground capital, Verni. Of course, from time to time, someone in the Council of the Great Houses would accuse the Ixians of manufacturing forbidden technologies. To keep curious noses away from the planet, the inhabitants of Ix spread strange and ominous rumors about their homeland. The most interesting thing was that, outwardly, everything looked quite pastoral, but inside. During the reign of the Padishah Emperor Fondil III, a full-fledged economic war broke out between Ix and Riches. The reason was the lucrative orders from the Spacing Guild. The Ixians won that struggle. By the beginning of the reign of the next Padishah Emperor, Elrod Ix had secured a monopoly on the production of Hayliners, the massive guild ships for interstellar travel. The wealth of Ix was not wasted. Much of it, often secretly, was invested in new developments. It was precisely these innovations that brought House Vernius into direct conflict with the Emperor's interests. The Ixians developed a more capacious ship for the Guild. The Guild, in turn, paid House Carino a share of the transport revenue, based on the number of trips. The new ships allowed the Guild to cut costs, and House Carino lost income. Emperor Elrod was enraged. Throughout the ages, the actions of House Carino were never known for originality. Once again, the Padishah Emperor struck a secret deal with the Bene Tlilax. Face dancers incited a rebellion among the lower caste of Ixians, and Elrod conveniently aided them with disguised Sardaukar. The heirs of House Vernius and the future Duke Leto I Atreides managed to escape from Ix. There was little to complain about it. The suboids, who had been swayed into rioting, also openly violated imperial laws. They were not humans in the strict sense of the word. These were mindless cyborgs. But Elrod was not concerned with violations related to technology. The Bene Tlilax had promised him that, upon gaining access to Ix's scientific and production facilities, they would create synthetic spice. The success of such a project could fundamentally alter the relationship between the Imperial House and the Spacing Guild, which held nearly unlimited power in the known universe. Alas, the Tlilaxu failed to fulfill their promise. Perhaps only because of this did the young Duke Leto I Atreides manage to push for the return of Ix to House Vernius in the Landsraad and before the new emperor. Shaddam IV returned Ix to its former owners but held a grudge against the Atreides. Unfortunately, Count Romber Vernius proved incapable of ruling effectively after all his ordeals. Gradually, a circle of deputies formed around him. Thus, quietly and peacefully, Ix passed under the control of the Council of Technocrats, and Count Vernius performed only ceremonial functions in the Landsraad. Not only massive spacefaring ships were developed in Ix's underground laboratories. Among the undeniable achievements of the Ixians during the Carino Padishah Empire was the hunter-seeker, a saboteur's weapon of choice. These remotely controlled deadly toys were long used by the Imperial Sardaukar. However, the greatest scientific breakthroughs were still to come. The Council of Technocrats' relations with Paul Atreides did not go well from the start. The Technocrats decided to create an Ixian confederation and pressure the new emperor. Their demands were not new at all. Tax cuts for themselves, of course, and the preservation of a constitutional monarchy by limiting the emperor's power with the Landsraad. Apparently, Paul Muad'Dib resembled his father little. He refused the Ixians' demands. No limitations were needed for his vision of the Golden Path. Emperor Atreides abolished the Constitution, the Landsraad, and Chom, and threatened the Spacing Guild with the destruction of spice. All this occurred in the year 10,205 AG, and the Guild was subtly hinted that if it wished to retain part of its privileges, its economic relations with Ix should be severed. Ix had to submit. However, the great Emperor Atreides was not particularly concerned with the people. Therefore, in 10,207 AG, the last representative of House Vernius, Count Bronzo, was executed on Ix. Just like that, out of redundancy. And the Ixians, squeezed by exile and economic blockade, redoubled their efforts in developing forbidden technologies. A scientific and technological breakthrough by the Ixians occurred under the son of Muad'Dib, God Emperor Leto II Atreides. Truly considering themselves enemies of the ruling dynasty and tyranny in general, the rulers of Ix completely abandoned the laws of the Butlerian Jihad, creating the technological coalition known as the Ixian Corps. The rebel technocrats produced not only las guns, their arsenal gradually included actual computers. Of course, when inventing their null field, the Ixians sincerely believed it reliably concealed activities from those possessing prescience. Essentially, it did. No guild navigator could see what was happening beneath the cover of this groundbreaking invention. In a room hidden by the null field, the Ixians raised the girl Hinori and sent her as an ambassador to the God Emperor. Naturally, the idea of awakening remnants of humanity in Leto II was merely a clever plot to overthrow the tyrant. However, the Ixians failed to consider that the golden path of the Emperor included, among other things, his death. Undoubtedly, the doomed love for Hinori nudged events forward, but it did so just as much as the benevolent observation by Lord Leto of the revolutionary activities of the Duncan Idaho and Siona Atreides. In their quest to overthrow the hated Atreides in the form of the long-lived worm, the Ixians failed to notice the most important thing. The Golden Path, whose foresight broke Paul Muad'Dib, led directly through the violation of prohibitions by the Ixians. Besides the null field, which concealed not only rooms and women from prescient vision but also spaceships, the Ixians did eventually invent a synthetic replacement for the Guild Navigator. This happened several decades after the death of the God Emperor Leto II, which quite literally plunged the universe into chaos. Perhaps the preborn son of Muad'Dib really was a god, because who else would have the will to wait for their own death for 3,500 years? And what about the people? The people would certainly have destroyed themselves if not for Ix's refusal to abide by the bans on technology. Interstellar travel via computers that did not consume spice became accessible to many, and those who wished to avoid bloody wars rushed out of the known universe. However, the technocracy on Ix eventually turned into a bureaucracy. The Ixians, having secured a leading position in what remained of the Atreides Empire, quickly destroyed themselves. The returning honored matres from the scattering obliterated the decayed remnants of the Ixian core. But the inventions remained. The invisible ships and many other elements of the Ixian legacy played a decisive role in the very end of the story, called the Kralizek. The Ixians, in Frank Herbert's works, are a mysterious people, always in opposition to imperial power. Everyone knows that these same Ixians disregard the fundamental laws established by the Butlerian Jihad. and everyone silently agrees that life without technology is impossible. That means Ix is necessary. It is needed by the Emperor, needed by the Landsraad, needed by the Spacing Guild, whose power in the universe depends greatly on Ix. The Ixians, in Brian Herbert's works, are a people with a long and sorrowful history, who have carried through all the ages of trials an insatiable thirst for science and technology, and along with it, a hatred for those who rule the universe. The rises and falls of the Ixians always affect the overall situation in the Empire. Whatever happens, there is always the mysterious Ixian trace. Yet, when the Ixian core took power into its own hands, it could not avoid degradation and its entirely predictable downfall. Perhaps we should feel pity for a community that so desperately wanted to overthrow tyrants. After all, in the end, it was the Ixians who essentially saved humanity by giving the spiders a chance to scatter from the jar. And it was precisely this that Lord Leto foresaw in his dreams of the Golden Path. Do not fear the Ixians. They may still create machines, but they can no longer create Arrakis. I know, I was there, says the God Emperor on his deathbed. And that's all from me. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell. Your activity is the best reward for me. Thank you for your attention. See you soon. Bye.